As you know from the description of tonight's event, I'm a former missionary and a convert to Judaism. I didn't always say that so easily when we first got here. I wanted to fit in, and I wanted my children to fit in, and I didn't want us to be seen as different. I could be just like anybody else, and nobody had to know that I was a ger. I've worked in the counter-missionary field for about 15 years now, and it's not been publicly. All of my efforts were behind the scenes, and most of you had no idea of my background. I was raised as an evangelical Christian. My father was an evangelical minister. I was taught to be a missionary from a young age, as is everybody in the evangelical church. The Great Commission is the cornerstone of evangelical Christianity. It's the mission to convert people. It's a big deal. It's a commandment from Jesus himself, and it's an obligation. It's taken very seriously, and I took it very seriously. Bringing as many people as I could to Jesus was a goal that I set for myself every day. I was pretty good at it. I found it pretty easy to share Jesus with my peers, and I didn't have any problem inviting my friends to church. It wasn't until my adult life that focus turned towards Jews. That involved learning more deceptive techniques that were not typical Christianity. The most important thing to learn was how to get access to a Jew, and then once you get access to a Jew, how to present and the language used to present Jesus in a way that wouldn't send them running. Unfortunately, I was successful among less affiliated Jews, those who had very little knowledge of their own Bible. I had no doubt in my mind that Jesus was the Messiah, and I had learned through the church all of the text in Tanakh to prove that. Reaching Jews that I encountered at the JCC was easy, but I was attracted to the Orthodox world. It fascinated me that the Orthodox people were so dedicated and committed to God, and I couldn't understand how they could be so religious but not know Jesus. I couldn't imagine anything more beautiful than bringing somebody that already had such a strong connection to God to Jesus, their Jewish Messiah. As you can imagine, that line didn't go over so well with frum Jews. Religious Jews are more knowledgeable, and they didn't fall so easily for my emotional plea or my repackaging Jesus with a Jewish flavor. To reach them, I was really going to have to learn the text and know how to argue them, the verses in Tanakh that prove that Jesus is the Messiah. In my mind, if I could just get a Jew to read these passages, they would see Jesus in them just as clearly as I did. I tried, and they didn't make it so easy for me. Some of them found it very fun to taunt me. They would tell me things like, "What you're saying is mistranslated," or "You're taking things out of context," which I thought was absolutely absurd. I would argue back with them and say, "You're just regurgitating what your rabbis tell you, and if you would just look at it yourself, you would see." I would quote a specific verse, and they would ask me about the verses around that verse, as if that mattered. I didn't think that was relevant. What does it matter if I know what Isaiah 52 says when it's Isaiah 53 that talks about Jesus? The context was Jesus, and I just didn't see a problem. We were speaking different languages, and they seemed to be having fun, but for me it was very frustrating. Eventually, I was convinced that maybe I need to look at the text a little bit differently. I needed to find another way to present this if I was going to be successful. Knowing that I was still absolutely right, I set out to learn the entire chapters surrounding the verses that I was quoting to them. That didn't work out so well for me. Suddenly, what was once very clear to me wasn't fitting so well. Reading things in context, the prophecies that meant Jesus didn't exactly mean what I thought they meant. I was confused, and honestly, I was a little scared because I wasn't able to make these things work. I went back to those Orthodox Jews just a little bit more humble, still knowing that I was absolutely right. Somehow, Jesus was in there. But the tables were turning, and I started to ask them about the text. That's when I was introduced to an audio series, which is now available for free online. There was one Jew who thought that perhaps I was ready to see the error in my ways. He was very wrong. I'm pretty darn stubborn. What he gave me was the jackpot. It was the Jewish response to Christian missionaries. These were the arguments that they were using against me. So now all I had to do was learn how to counter these arguments from this rabbi. If I could destroy the arguments of their rabbi, I would be able to reach them. That was going to be a piece of cake. And that's when my entire world crumbled. I'm not exaggerating when I say that these tapes were an atomic bomb in my life. I couldn't counter this rabbi, not a single argument. One by one, he completely destroyed every one of the prophecies that I knew proved Jesus. He was right. The Christian Bible had purposely mistranslated verses, and it was with an agenda to make them appear Christological. Everything I knew by heart completely fell apart. Nothing meant what I thought that it meant. I felt betrayed. I was lied to. I thought, how could the church be that evil? For somebody like me, whose every moment was focused on being a good Christian, this was a full-on religious and emotional crisis. It was traumatic. I went through every stage of grief. It was anger, betrayal, sadness, and hopelessness. My entire identity was lost because Jesus was the core of who I was as a person. Everything I said in my life, everything I did was centered around that belief. Without that, getting up in the morning had no meaning and no purpose. Because to me, Jesus was very real. He was somebody who was one with me since I was a child. I believed that he was with me every day, that he walked with me, that he directed everything I did in my life. So to discover that he was nothing more than an imaginary friend, that was beyond painful. At one point, I prayed so deeply to God, and then something hit me. I became enraged. I threw my pillow at the wall and I screamed, "You don't even exist!" And when you find yourself in such a hopeless place and you realize that there's not even a God to cry out to, I can't explain it, but that's just unbearable. I mustered up the courage to call this rabbi directly. And I asked him, who was Jesus? If he's not who I thought he was, please just tell me that there was some purpose for his existence. Did he even exist? Somehow that rabbi knew that I needed to know more than just that simple answer. He told me that what I was doing was struggling to fit Jesus and file him away in some way that made sense. But the bottom line is, if Jesus was not the Messiah, then nothing else matters. That was obvious, but at that moment, that simple explanation was powerful. I went on crying to him, explaining my trauma in figuring out and finding out that there was no God. And he stopped me. He explained, you simply discovered that Jesus is not the Messiah. God is still very, very much there. In my bubble of grief, I was simply not able to separate Jesus and God because in Christianity, they're very much one and the same. I'm pretty stubborn, so I don't know how, but somehow he got through to me. And my life from that point on took a whole new direction. I set out to learn Torah from scratch, which, because my mind was so filled with an entirely different belief system, that wasn't so easy. When I began to learn Torah without my Jesus filter, it was so beautiful and so inspiring. When I learned the traditions and the mitzvot and the meaning behind the mitzvot, they were so special, it inspired me to do more. And I see every mitzvah as an opportunity to kiss Hashem and to thank him for all of the blessings in my life. The conversion process, that was pretty grueling. I think every convert will tell you that they go through their own personal Mitzrayim. But today, I am so thankful. My children don't know anything about Christianity. They speak Hebrew. I have a son that's a soldier in the IDF. I'm so proud of all of them. They have a religious day school education that I envy very much. And they learn Torah in its purest form. I love learning Torah, and I'm always amazed at how deep the Torah goes. Something significant that I learned about Christianity was the deeper I delved into Christianity, the more the Christian Bible and the theology, it fell apart and it became more confusing. Unlike Torah, when every level you unpeel and the deeper you go, the more it makes sense and the more clear it becomes. I met my husband, and we married in Hebron a year after my conversion was complete. Being married to a doctor, our home becomes a clinic pretty often. We laugh that our Shabbos table doubles as an OR. Sometimes that's 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. He always answers, and I always have to be cognizant in every situation of his professional and ethical obligation that comes with being a doctor. If he's driving and we pass by an accident, it's my responsibility to gauge the situation and see if there's an emergency response person there. If there's not, I know that I have to jump into the driver's seat and he has to run. Wherever we are, it doesn't matter if we're on vacation and he's in his bathing suit. If we hear that phrase, "Is there a doctor?" he can't ignore it. He has a skill set and a training that's ingrained in him. When there's a medical situation and everybody's standing around not knowing what's going on, he recognizes the symptoms and he knows exactly what he's dealing with. Being a convert isn't so easy. I know we have quite a few in here tonight, and I think they would agree with me. They would like to really just be accepted as any other Jew. I told you that when we first arrived, I had decided that I was not going to tell anybody about my past. We had a new place, a new life. Many of you followed my photography, my political involvement. But on this issue, I kept my mouth shut, at least publicly. I was watching and learning about the missionary situation here in Israel when I got here, and it was worse than I imagined. When I first arrived here in 2015, the reported number of Jews identifying themselves as Messianic was 15,000. And there was 120 Messianic congregations. I thought that was terrible. Privately, I was volunteering for an organization in the counter-missionary field, and I was trying to do whatever I felt I could to contribute. But in a very short period of time, I watched those numbers double. By 2020, the number of Jews identifying themselves as Messianic had turned to 30,000. And the directory of Messianic organizations that I was watching had grown to 300. Now more than ever, there are intense websites and media campaigns targeting Jews for conversion. Today, there are more than 200 websites in Israel alone that are dedicated to bringing the gospel message to Jews in English, in Hebrew, and in Russian. What was mind-boggling was that Jewish leadership was forming partnerships with these groups. In some cases, I was finding that missionaries were running government programs. People just had no idea what they were dealing with. We had meetings occasionally. I would pull up the organization's website in English, their newsletter, and their YouTube channels, and I would show they're converting Holocaust survivors. They're converting youth, our soldiers, the most vulnerable in our population. They simply had no idea. The more I learned how ensconced our government is with people that I thought should be on the most wanted list, our biggest threats, the more I realized that I can't be silent. I didn't seek out a life as a missionary. I didn't choose it as a career, and knowing what I know now about the deception of the church, it's not a title that I'm proud of by any means. But I do know that world, and it does give me a unique skill set. I know the language, and I can see things that most Jews, they're just not seeing. I slowly started coming out of the closet. I started to share how and why I know about the tactics that are being used to convert Jews here in Israel. I founded Beyneynu, and our first big case started with a 5-minute video of a missionary that was boasting about how they had acquired a license to broadcast the gospel of Jesus Christ throughout the land of Israel. Over and over, the CEO of God TV declared that they were going to bring 9 million Jews to Jesus. I couldn't believe that the government allowed this. That video went viral overnight. The situation made international news for weeks as petitions began and court cases unraveled. Rabbi Singer, thank God, had just made Aliyah. Working together on this issue, we were able to get that channel off the air. From that point on, we publicized case after case. Benenu has been making major headlines just about every month since we started. From God TV, we went on to expose missionaries operating Jewish agency programs for lone soldiers and for Olim. Followed by that was a black minister, Bishop Plummer, who arrived here and immediately started 5 churches. He was targeting Ethiopian Jews. Then there was a coffee shop in Tel Aviv. They were going after Holocaust survivors. They were luring youth with music concerts and then sharing Jesus with them when they got there. There's a humanitarian aid group who was proudly boasting to its supporters, actually admitting that they were exploiting the tragic situation that families found themselves in during the pandemic. They were telling their supporters that the coronavirus was giving them the opportunity to bring Jesus to the Jewish people, and that the lockdowns were part of God's plan for the second coming. From Jews were recently being tricked by casting calls. When they asked, they were actually lied to and told that it's not a Christian film, only to be presented with a legal waiver from Christian Broadcasting Network. Of course, only once they were in the middle of the desert at 4 o'clock in the morning. These frum Jews later discovered through our reports that it was in fact a Jesus film that they were featured in. Then there was a missionary who was using children to distribute Christian materials to other children in the playgrounds. It's illegal here in Israel to proselytize to children, but that only applies from an adult to a minor. So they're using other children to reach Jewish children. Then, of course, there are the ones that I'm sure you're all familiar with. The Elk case, portraying himself as a rabbi in French Hill, followed by the Buckles, and then the Edelmans. Many of us were personally involved in that one. Besides the deceptive agenda and the lies, those were clear cases of immigration fraud. And now there's this terrible case in Phoenix, Arizona, the Dawson family, a father and son who are portraying themselves as rabbis and participating in all kinds of Jewish rituals. It's left behind a halakhic mess. I'd love to take credit for these, but the truth is, these cases were only successful because Jews cared enough not to just hear about them, but after we publicized them, they raised their voices and demanded that something be done about it. Without that pressure, we couldn't have gotten the government to revoke the license for God TV. We couldn't have gotten them to sever the relationship with the missionaries in Tiberia. There's still a lot to talk about, but I'm going to leave the rest to Rabbi Singer. I really thank you for all of your continued love and support to me personally. Going public with my story and launching Beyneynu is largely because of the love and the support that I've been getting right here. I'm very grateful to you.